Welcome to Conversations with LSN Tap, where we meet interesting people and hear how they are increasing access to justice through technology. Here's your host, Shelley Reed.
Today's episode, I'm Shelley Reed, manager of the Legal Services National Technology Assistance Project. Today, we're here with our guest, Julie Ciccolini, to talk about Techtivist and her story. So welcome, Julie. Is there anything that you would like to tell our audience about yourselves?
Hi, I'm so excited to be here and talk about Techtivist. So thanks for having me. And yeah, let's get into it.
So Techtivist is billed as a revolutionary database designed for lawyers, journalists, and community groups to track law enforcement misconduct. Can you tell what drove you to found the company?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, actually. So this product was born 10 years ago. I was working as a paralegal at the Legal Aid Society in New York. And a really brilliant civil rights attorney, Cynthia Conti Cook, had actually been litigating a lot of civil rights lawsuits against police officers and repeatedly seeing the same officers get in trouble over and over again, and was like, how is this happening? And so she had the idea to start a database to try and solve this problem with what we could find out about officer misconduct. At the time, and in certain states still, there are very strict laws that govern this data. And as a little paralegal, I decided we probably needed a technical solution to do this. So taught myself a little bit of programming, what I could, to come up with a very crappy version of a database. But it had a lot of success actually when we used it in New York. And so I was there for 5 years. We ended up having all of the defenders in the state using this one system. And then we decided it made sense to have other defenders across the country use it. So we got a grant, and I went to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and there for 3 years helped other public defenders set up this system and start tracking police misconduct in their respective states and counties. When that grant ended was when I decided this work needed to continue, and I founded Techtivist. So I'd say it more happened to me. I didn't expect this to be my career, but got lucky and built a product that I'm very, very passionate about and won't give up on.
So that's really interesting. So how did you get where you are today? What was your career path like before this, Techtivist happened?
Yes, I I studied psychology in undergrad, so I don't know. I always wanted to work in human rights, and I joined the Legal Aid Society to do that. I really believed in the work they do. Once I built this product, I realized there was a real big lack of tech in the nonprofit world. We were just so far behind. And I would say we still are far behind today at harnessing the latest technology. So I went and got a master's degree in human rights, but it was human rights and technology. I was able to kind of create my own little field of study. From there, I went to Human Rights Watch, which is a big international NGO, as a research technologist. And it was the first time they ever had a unit dedicated to pairing research with technology. And I learned so much there of the simple power of being able to scrape data from a website or optically character recognize some PDFs so we can get the text out, allowed us to get so deep at human rights issues. And these were actually really low tech solutions. Well, not low tech, but it wasn't the most advanced thing we were doing. But just by harnessing this little bit of technology, we could really change our reporting and the abuses we could uncover. So after that experience, I knew a lot more about tech, a lot more about human rights. I went back to this initial issue of police misconduct, the lack of discovery in the legal system, and continued to work on this product. I think that answers your question. It's an interesting career path for sure. Very, very niche.
So I mean, it all, looking at your bio and your LinkedIn information, it does look like there were actually definitely steps that led you right where where you are today, which, compared to mine, where, I'm all over the place, literally around the world, and many different career paths to get to where I am. So it's really interesting how everything seemed to build for you to this. And I found it interesting that you started off focusing on research on children and child welfare, and did some work in Rwanda and the Congo. Um, and then you did some work in poverty. So, do you want to talk about how that maybe shaped your, um, Techtivist? Because all of those things, child welfare and poverty, can lead to the system that we have today, with criminal justice. So, do you
Yeah.
see that there's a
I
common
think,
bond there?
yeah, I did a lot of research back in the day. So initially my career was really focused in on research areas and finding programming and solutions almost to those problems. But it definitely gave me the foundation to understand that everything was very connected, and kind of changed my worldview of the way poverty leads to crime, or the way that different groupthink can lead to certain outcomes, the way we need trust and accountability, which was a lot of what the research I did in Rwanda was about, and how there's other ways of approaching justice besides incarceration. And there's a lot of reasons people choose to commit crime that are more societal factors than personal bad behavior. And I think that really laid the foundation to believe that we need to decarcerate and very much get away from the current mass incarceration system we have in the state. So that led me to be very passionate about public defense and working in the public, just social justice in general, but working for a public defender. So it did all line up in a weird way. It's funny how the universe works, but I definitely landed at legal aid at the right time and in the right position to kind of build something that is now Techtivist.
Really interesting. I found your career path really fascinating. And we were discussing before we started recording that you like to take advantage of the remote work options that are available. So tell me a little bit about yourself outside of work. What do you like to do with your spare time?
So I love to travel. It is definitely my biggest hobby, a very privileged hobby, but I am technically homeless and I've been homeless for 3 years. All of my stuff lives in storage and boxes, but there's really only 2 suitcases at this point. I don't have stuff anymore. So I COVID, we were all working remotely. And because I've always worked in tech and human rights, I realized that I could work very, very remotely. And I think I took an initial trip to Puerto Rico and was like, oh, this is great. I started renting out my New York City apartment and just taking longer trips, 3 months at a time here. And then I hated being a landlord because, oof, especially in New York City. So I said, I don't think I even need the apartment anymore. And I got rid of pretty much everything besides a couple boxes in grandma's basement. And I have been, yeah, traveling ever since. I'm not always out of the States, but often I like to go to Europe and Africa because I like working nights. It just works better for me. I'm an evening worker. So I've been in 18 countries in the past 3 years. Um, Always, yeah, figuring out a new way, a new lifestyle to live, often in places where I don't know the language, but it's my fun little adventure outside of work. I'm currently in Mauritius, which is a very tiny little island off the east coast of Africa. Super diverse, fascinating country with a long, long history. And luckily, they speak English and French and Creole, but I get by pretty well here.
That's awesome. I mean, that's like the dream, to be that digital nomad that
Yeah,
that
I got
that
really
remote
lucky.
work allows us to do. So,
Yeah.
going back to Techtivist, what are some of the challenges that you faced along the way in building the company? And then, along with that, are there any success stories that you can share?
Yeah. I often find myself saying, oh, there's a reason nobody's done this before. More often, more days than I don't. There's a lot of challenges just with any sort of national scope of a project working in the legal field because laws are different in every state, especially when we're talking about data and disclosure policies. So, building a product that can work in any jurisdiction has been a huge challenge. And working with defenders, I'll be honest, I love my legal aid organizations, but a lot of the tech is a little bit older school, and there's a less willingness to use a cloud-based app. There's also necessary security requirements that make it very difficult to host things off premise, for example. So just having a piece of software that works in with a federal defender, a county defender, a state government agency, a nonprofit has been definitely a challenge. The getting information from the police, which is kind of what the product does. I think I don't know if I've explained it very clearly, but Techtivist is really a database that defenders can use to track police misconduct and disclosures about police misconduct, as well as prosecutor misconduct or any people and witnesses that they're interested in tracking. So we also, have innocence organizations who use it, who track all of the different players in a case. And it's a way to see the different incidents and locations and everything that is sorry, just got a little distracted there for a second. It's a way to see all of the different players, incidents, and locations that are happening in specific cases. It also allows attorneys to look up an officer and see the history of what we know has been disclosed about them before. And so because of that, we're trying to get data from the police, which is never easy. And we've come up with a lot of creative workarounds. Often working at a legal aid organization, because they're state agencies, they also are required to give open records back. And so storing data as work product and making sure it's not subject to freedom of information requests the other way has also been a big challenge. Those are the main ones that just come to the top of my head, but it is not easy work.
I can imagine. So the listeners know that I worked in local government prior to going to law school late in life. But what many of them don't realize is that local government experience was within law enforcement. So even though I am acutely aware that there are bad actors in that community, I also know that there are, officers who are out there trying to do the best work that they can. But I have personal experience from the police academy that my life was threatened by my fellow trainees because I didn't fall into line behind behind what they felt the training should be. And I also have a good friend who basically was pushed out of a department for citing a fellow officer for drunk driving. So, I can see both sides of the equation. So it's really interesting to me. And I understand the challenges that you would face trying to get that information. Here in Virginia, government agencies don't have to answer to FOIA requests to people who are not residents of the state of Virginia. So it must be a huge challenge to get all of that information. And, I think that we have to be accountable. Our police have to be accountable for their actions. So I really like this. The joke was my brother-in-law was also a sheriff's deputy. And I always joked that I was going to be a public defender after going to law school. And that was always, good for Thanksgiving, conversations. Yeah. That he was going to book them and I was going to get him, set him free. But, what I found is that if the police are doing their job right and doing their job well, there's nothing to be feared from Techtivist or other systems that are reporting on the work. but I would not
Yeah.
say that my attitude is reflective of many people in that field. Yeah, so it has to be a huge challenge. Um, so do you,
Definitely. Well, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say I think a lot of what we focus on too is simply the disclosure policies and how those are a huge problem. So it's not only that nothing's being tracked, but it's also that information is often being um, not intentionally hidden, but just not disclosed by prosecutors because they're not tracking it themselves. And so we are really a place to just document what is known, and it's not necessarily going after specific bad actors, but it is trying to change the system and the structure of way information gets disclosed. So I'm sure, as you know, there's a Brady obligation that prosecutors have to disclose information about uh, the who's ever testifying, if it isn't officers, anything that could be I'm going to get the legal terms wrong here. I always say material, but I don't know if it's material. Anyways, they have to disclose anything that could potentially be exculpatory, and that includes any of that officer's prior records. If the prosecutor is unaware that those exist, though, then they don't have to disclose them. And so often they're just totally unaware. They're happy to be totally unaware. And that means the defenders are totally at a disadvantage and asymmetry of information. We're trying to make it so that the defenders have that information, which means that the prosecutors also have to track it. And if the prosecutors have to track it, then they know what officers will be trusted on the stand and which officers won't. And if they have officers who they know won't be trusted on the stand, we would hope that they may stop bringing cases by that officer. And so it's not necessarily like, oh, we have these few bad apples. It's that this whole system is not functioning or holding anyone accountable. And we're trying to change that by giving defenders access to information they should have.
Absolutely. You know, it's a change of mindset, a change of, I don't know. Law enforcement has been its own, I don't know, I like to call it here in Virginia, kind of like their own fiefdoms, and they control information, they control everything about it. So keeping it open to the public, they're supposed to be public service. So what they do should be open to viewing by the public. So that's something that I think that we are seeing some change because of organizations, like Techtivist and other organizations. So it's really, it's fun to explore this because, legal aid works very closely with the National Legal Aid and Defenders Association. We have a joint conference every year, and it's coming up in the fall. So it's nice that we're exploring more topics that, hit their, their area of work. So can you, while we're exploring this, sharing of information, and what are some of the like myths or misconceptions about tracking police misconduct that you encounter that people need to know?
I think there's huge misconceptions for people who aren't working within the system. Public defenders do a little more, but I think one that surprises everyone is that officers always often don't have a unique identifier or really any sort of license that we can use to track them. So it's very, very difficult actually. When I was working tracking the NYPD, for example, for 60,000 officers who have very common names, some of them, to know who's who and who's doing what. And that makes it very easy for them to switch counties or to switch states. And there's really no record of who they were and what they were doing. There are a lot of laws changing, particularly post police officer standards and training commissions that sometimes license and can decertify officers, but often they can only decertify officers for a few things, and it's only within a state. So an officer can just cross border lines and get hired again, and that information stays within the state that it's in. And that, again, is really usually egregious misconduct. If they have a horrible track record within an agency, there's nothing that's following them with that track record. It's very unlike attorneys who have a bar number, for example, and the state knows exactly who you are and you have this identifier and where you to get in trouble that's going in your little file. Police officers don't have that. And it makes it very difficult for projects like mine who are trying to track them with just what we know publicly, when their badge numbers can change. And, one day you're 127 and the next you're 895 and you're Michael Williams. So there's 10 different officers on your squad like that. That shocked me when I first started working in the field. I think most people still don't know that that is a problem. Yeah, so I think another myth is that information is being tracked more effectively than it is. The biggest thing that surprised me when I first started at Legal Aid was how often I could find things about an officer's history that didn't go anywhere. So, for example, there was this one officer, I still remember his name, who I found on Westlaw had 3 prior judges find him incredible, which means they said on the record they do not believe his testimony. And that officer was testifying in one of our cases, because when a judge finds an officer incredible, there's no direction of what has to happen with that information. It's not, okay, that has to get put in a file and that has to go on and you have to add them to a Brady list. You can. We would appreciate prosecutors who add it to a Brady list. Sometimes they do, but there's no guarantee. There's no framework for this. And so an officer can get caught lying in one courtroom and go to the next one and testify, and no one is any wiser, which is why we created the system, so that if the defenders know that officer has been caught lying before, then the prosecutors are going to need to start tracking that. And I think the other thing I was saying is there were just a lot of times where information would come out in the public eye when I first started Legal Aid, and I thought, there's no way I need to track this, because there's no way this officer is going to be testifying again. A headline of officer caught on video dragging girlfriend with his car. I remember that headline, and I thought, okay, let's save the gigabytes in the database. I don't think we'll see this officer again. And sure enough, 6 months later, he arrested one of our clients. So there is definitely a bunch of flaws with the accountability systems, and even when they work, it is very, very delayed. And it's a huge reason why we have to track this as defenders, even though you would think it's not necessarily the defender's responsibility.
Yeah, so it's almost like they are like the ostrich, burying their head in the sand. If I don't know about it, it doesn't happen, or it didn't exist. But
Yeah.
that's not acceptable, especially in today's age of accountability. We have to do better. So what advice would you have for a person or an agency who is struggling with getting data on police misconduct? Do you have any tips or tricks that might help?
Yeah, definitely a bunch. The first thing is to start tracking everything that does come through in court, though, because occasionally you get that disclosure. Occasionally you find out about things and it needs to be saved so that you know it for the next case. There's a lot you can get through public records requests if you are super, super, super creative. So, for example, I was never granted my multiple requests to the New York City Police Department for a list of all of their officers. I just wanted their names, just to know who works in the department that polices me. I was never granted that, but I did know that they were going to be paid, and the Office of Payroll Administration would tell me who they're paying at what agency, and they don't care to hide that information. And so a creative foil to a payroll agency is actually how I get rosters of police departments. And I've used that same tactic in every state, because if you can find someone who has the data and less motivation to conceal it, you can usually get access to it. Not everything you can get through freedom of information laws, but there are all of the tricks that I've used available if you go on the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers website. The project that we ran this under when it was a grant project was called the Full Disclosure Project. And there's a million guides how to get started tracking police misconduct, blog articles, I should say, of these are all the data sources we look for. This is how to ask for it. If you get denied, here's where to go next. So it would make a boring podcast for me to riddle those off right now, but they exist online. Just Google NACDL Full Disclosure Project.
That's really interesting and a great resource for people to start. Yeah, it's really interesting. I know, the laws here in Virginia definitely protect, personal information. You can have your address shielded and things like that. And definitely the newspaper would publish salaries, but they couldn't publish names of law enforcement, but they would publish names of other government workers. So definitely a struggle to have to get past, some of them statutory, and legal, laws that are put into place for that protection. So, yeah.
Yeah. In New York, we used what we could find for a lot of advocacy. I think I can name at least 3 different city laws that we changed or got passed to make access to information more available. So, for example, civil rights lawsuits against the police department weren't being tracked, and we successfully got a city law to make it so that every year the law department has to post exactly how much they've paid out for lawsuits against the NYPD, who were the officers, what were the lawsuits, which just was a huge data source there. There were some officers with 40 lawsuits against them and millions in settlements that had been paid out, but you would never know because it wasn't tracked. Ultimately, there were a lot of little laws like that we forced to get put on the books and really advocated for, and we used the existing data of what we could track to do that and to make that case for why it needed to be public. The big law was that all civilian complaint data and internal affairs data, anything considered a personnel record, so officers getting in trouble within the department, was considered confidential and still very difficult to get disclosed. Even in a criminal case, if that officer was testifying, you would have to make a Gissendaner motion. In some places it's called a Pishus motion. It has different names, but pretty much you'd have to argue that there was something in that officer's file that was relevant to your case, but you had never seen the file. So how do you make that argument? And that was really why we kind of started tracking exactly whatever was disclosed when we could, and using open source tools, news articles, lawsuits, to get some insight into officers' history. But anyways, the really long and short of it is after a lot of advocacy, a lot of publicizing that this was a problematic law, and the huge momentum post George Floyd, that state law was overturned, which was huge. And so now in New York State, that information is public, and you can in theory get it through a public records request. Of course, there's still a ton of problems with doing that. But we are seeing those laws slowly change with huge pushes for transparency.
That's awesome. So how do you measure the impact of your work? Obviously there's huge personal gratification, but as for Techtivist, how are you measuring the impact?
The system change. It's very hard to know. I mean, we see it in one-on-one cases a lot. This case was dismissed as soon as we made a Brady demand, or we were able to prove that someone did not disclose what they should have, and that was a Brady violation, and that case was disclosed. Or the jury did not believe the cop after he was cross-examined on his history of misconduct. So we've definitely seen a lot of that, but it is always difficult because could still be convicted but get a shorter sentence or have a better plea. It's not necessarily a case win, but this information played a role in other mitigating factors too. And so you can never just say, okay, we did that. But the reason I know it works is the way we saw the system change in New York. And that is how I continue to measure it. Because defenders were tracking this, prosecutors finally had to start tracking it. And I know the Manhattan DA specifically came out and wrote in a letter and specifically said, because of our database, that they needed better access to information from the NYPD, because they're getting caught off guard in court with these officers' histories that they don't know about. And so because of the defenders, now the prosecutors have to act. And if the prosecutors have to act, the police department had to get in line. Of course, it's very political, but that's a huge shift for a prosecutor to come out publicly against the police. And they had to start their own databases, and they had to get access to that information. And now it should be regularly disclosed. If it isn't, the defenders can say, I know this exists and it should have been disclosed. And this case will be dismissed, and they'll continue to be dismissed until you start giving me the information that I'm entitled to. We saw that in New York, and now we're seeing it. One of the states I can talk about, I work with the Maryland Public Defender, the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. And they've had a lot of success with the database as well, not only in one-on-one cases, but in changing the system and the way information is disclosed. And so that's when we know it is working, when it's not just the defenders who are behaving differently, but also the prosecutors and the police departments.
It's really interesting. So how many, how many states are people using Techtivist to track their police?
5 right now.
That's awesome.
5 right now. Hopefully, eventually a lot more. But yes, it takes time to work with the state and get them all set up. We've had a couple that we're hoping to rope back in, but it's not always statewide. The 5 that I mentioned are, but sometimes we can do this within a county, or in California, for example, it's a huge state and it doesn't really make sense to have one giant database. So like we've worked with the San Francisco Public Defender before, just focusing on specific counties. But ideally, yeah, we need to get every state doing this.
So what are your goals and vision for the future of Techtivist?
I think that's it. I think I just said it. I really think this is a foundational part of defense work. It's become one of my firm beliefs that it's now something we have to do. In the past, you might not have had a paralegal or investigator on the case, or you might not have thought you had to, Google search the witness, but we're evolving. And this is the next evolution. Defenders have to track this information. And so I really want to push this to be more part of the practice and the culture of defense agencies. I would love if everyone used the Techtivist software, because we specifically built it for this person, but it doesn't have to start there. I've helped countless defenders with lower resource options, just even using file folders, Google Sheets, whatever they can, Airtable, to start tracking this in a comprehensive way. So it just needs to be part of the work, and that is my goal.
We certainly want to spread the words that resources are out there, because sometimes people just don't realize they have a problem, but they haven't heard that there's a solution available. So hopefully this will help get the word out.
No, I appreciate that. I have a small marketing team of me, so
I can relate to that.
Yes.
Oh, so we heard a little bit, some positive stories, some impact, but is there a particular story that touched you and let you know that you were really on the right path with Techtivist?
I think there's a recent story that comes to mind, because it almost makes me bang my head against a desk. I don't know if it's the most touching story, but this was in Maryland, and I don't want to, because I'm not staring at this case, get any details wrong, but someone had been convicted of attempted murder on the testimony of a detective. And even the victim of the attempted murder had testified that it wasn't the person convicted, but the detective testified and was convincing that it was, and the person was convicted. In a later case, something that the detective was involved in a memo was disclosed, and in black magic marker they had redacted something, but the defender could see through the black magic marker that it was a sustained perjury allegation against that detective. And so they inquired more, and they found more about that detective's file, and they had 19 internal affairs allegations before, including a sustained perjury finding. Because of the database, right, that information is now known that exists. And the attorney I work with was able to get the attempted murder conviction overturned after they realized that that particular information had never been disclosed. And so, I mean, this is not only huge, right, to overturn a conviction, but it's just wild that a black magic marker is the faultiness, the dried out magic marker that someone's kid probably played with too long or something, is how we achieve justice in that case. It's super problematic, right? And so to me, knowing that because we eventually did find out about it and store it, it helps get someone out of prison is huge. But also moving to a system where things like that aren't being redacted when they shouldn't be, and trying to be hidden is the key. So it's not the most touching story, but it's definitely, I think about that black magic marker a lot.
Well, and we are thankful that they have not taken any of our educational webinars and, and learned
on how to properly redact.
So actually was that's actually, AI is actually able to remove much redaction or predict what is behind, the redaction. So even current redactions are, there's the chance that AI will be able to overcome those efforts. So just put that out there.
Wow,
That was something that came up this week.
I've not heard of that. So interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So this has been really good discussion. I've really enjoyed hearing this, having worked for law enforcement, and seeing, the see-me side personally. I believe that the way for our country to have justice is to be open and the story you just told, that's unbelievable to me that person still had a job. So
They're still an officer,
mm,
still a detective. Yeah.
Yes.
So
anyway, let's keep up the efforts, because we want justice comes through information, and unfortunately, why are we having to fight these battles when those are personnel issues? Really.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense for anyone. I mean, it's in the department's best interest to not have those people. I mean, depending on how they view it, but those cases are going to get thrown out, at least now, because we're aware of that information. And so that detective shouldn't be able to testify in any future case. And then what use are they to the department?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, very interesting. So as we move to the end of this interview, I just always like to ask my guests what one question is that they wish that they would be asked in an interview but aren't, and then answer that question.
Oh, that's so tough. And I do think you gave me time to prepare for that one, but I am not prepared. What would I have liked to be asked? I think I just want to say, so it's not a question. I'm sorry, I don't have the perfect answer for that. But that I am always open and willing to help people figure this out at their office, even if it isn't using the software that we have. I am just so passionate that this is like a foundational part of what every defender should be doing, and I will help them figure out how to do it no matter what. And I have a lot of resources I can share, so please reach out. that's my little plug.
So in that, what is the best way for them to reach out to you?
I am Julie at Techtivist.com or Techtivist.com. You can go to the website and there's a contact me form. So yeah, TECHTIVIST, Techtivist.
So along with that, how can people support Techtivist or get involved with your mission?
I think if you are a legal aid organization, reach out to me. We are not in the nonprofit space anymore, but so like there's no donate button, but we would just love to work with any office. And so if you know a legal aid office that is not using Techtivist software, connecting them to us would be hugely helpful. And keep pushing for police transparency.
Absolutely. So final question, what is your favorite app right now and why? Or what tech tip do you have for our listeners?
Okay, so I did see this question, and I have to say, if I'm being honest, my favorite app is TikTok. I'm not even young enough for it, but you know, that one can suck me in. But the actual app that has saved my life that is useful to people is LastPass. And I have fought with my family on this for so long. I am like a passionate about password managers. So it's a password manager that works on your phone, it works on your browser, it creates your passwords for you, it saves your passwords for you. All you need to remember is one password, and then all of your passwords are stored there. It's very secure. That's like their whole business model, right? And instead of using the same password for every different website, you never have to think about it again. You don't have to come up with any more again. So yeah, LastPass, it saves me every day.
Awesome. And, you know, that hasn't come up recently and it's so important, you know,
I
yeah,
I
my
think it's
husband
just
is the
because I
worst.
can crack every single account in my family because it's the same password for everything. And so it's 3 to 5 guesses and I'm in everyone's bank accounts. And so this has been something I've been pushing at home for a while as well.
Oh gosh. Well, that is an important thing. So thank you. It's a good reminder for all of us, you know, especially in this kind of work that for work and for personal, and don't use the same, you know, but that's a whole different webinar. So thank you, Julie. I really appreciate you joining us today. It's been a really great conversation. It's good to hear the work that's being done. And it's fun to get outside of the legal aid world and more toward the legal defender world. So I appreciate you joining us today. And I hope that people check out Techtivist and start pushing for more accountability within their community as well. So
Thank
enjoy your
you.
time
Yeah.
in Mauritius.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.